with the acclaimed artist Rina Banerjee, who has been in residence here for about 2 weeks, and we've worked out very hard. So thank you, Rina, for being a super trooper. And also thank you to the museum for hosting us, hosting the exhibition, hosting all of these wonderful sessions. And they're really designed to make us look closely at Rina's work, to provoke interesting questions about, I think, issues that really move many of us today. So very, very important for us. So I would like to now introduce Rina Banerjee to you, acclaimed artist, engineer. If you have looked at her works, you'll see the brain, both sides of her brain at work. And Rina is our Jeanette F. Watson Professor, Distinguished Visiting Professor of the Humanities, and has been in conversation with a wide array of faculty on campus, as well as students across not just the arts and humanities, but also the sciences. The Women in Science and Engineering program have also embraced her as one of their own. To her right, or rather to my right, to our right, is Professor David Driesen, who is a university professor in the College of Law. He's an expert on environmental policy and also climate change, and he has very kindly agreed to cross over to the dark side and come into the museum to be in dialogue with an artist. So thank you so much, David. I called him and said, could you please do this for us? And he said, never done this before, but why not? And I thought, all right, this is a good egg. This is someone I really would love to invite into the museum to do this with us. And to our left, Professor Mike Goode, who has been a long-term friend and wonderful colleague, who is the William P. Tolley Distinguished Professor also of the Humanities. For 3 years, he has this appointment, and his focus for the next 3 years is climate change. So it made perfect sense to bring them in dialogue with Rina, whose extraordinary work, A World Lost. Unfortunately, we couldn't bring you all into the gallery because of museum constraints, but we hope you have seen the work. If not, you will have an opportunity after this to visit and as well, of course, look at the other installations here. So welcome, everyone. I know many of you are from different departments. Welcome to our students. Hopefully there are some law students here who may not have stepped into the museum, so welcome if you come here for the first time. And a very distinguished guest is with us tonight, Professor Gayatri Spivak, who will be in dialogue with Rina tomorrow in the Herb Auditorium in Newhouse. All of you are invited to please come and listen to them. You will not have a chance like this perhaps in the next 4 years. So welcome, Professor Spivak, to our campus. All right, and over to the three of you now. Thank you.
Okay, should I start out? Yeah. Well, first of all, yeah, I wasn't quite sure how I fit in here, but the more I look at the work, the more glad I am I accepted this invitation. It's always been fascinating, and I've been thinking about it a lot. I think the first thing I wanted to talk about is your statement in the poster up there that it's hard when working on this to see the whole. And for that kind of reminded me of my history of learning the climate issue over the years and how nobody can see the whole of that issue clearly in a lot of ways. And this sort of started for me when I was in law school, and I was driving for some reason, and somebody who worked with George Whittle, who's one of the leading climate scientists, and I asked him, what is this global warming thing? Can you explain this to me? And he explained that the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is a heat-trapping gas, and that over time it warms the earth, and this is all sorts of effects. And then later on in the 90s, when I was, by this time, by the mid-90s, I was a law professor. I would meet with colleagues, and they would say, well, have you read this paper? It says that this might acidify the coral and make it die off. Have you read this paper about the effects on trees? Have you read this? And there's just enormous, there's like thousands of these, and then there's these efforts to assimilate this. And then there's different ways the disciplines try to translate all of that into something like a picture. I've been working in law and economics for a long time, so economists will like to talk about the dollars and cents of the, try to value damages to the environment in dollars, which means they have these numbers that reflect a tiny fraction of the effects, because there's only a tiny fraction where you have the whole coming up with numbers. And then they look at the cost of the technologies, and that's a little uncertain, but we have some idea what that is. And then I, as a lawyer, am interested in trying, especially as an environmental advocate, I'm interested in trying to figure out what I think is most central to understanding what I consider to be a big threat. And I think all the scientists from pretty early on understood it to be a big threat, even before they said it, because it was just sort of scary that you would change the climate of the world. One thing I tend to emphasize is the permanence of the greenhouse gases. That is, once you emit them, they stay up there. They're not getting cooler again. And every year in which there's 1 ton emitted, the problem's getting worse. So it's really, so from that perspective, you understood, besides the predicted effects that models would predict, you understood that it's not reversible, and to the extent you underestimated the effects, which is what we've done, you'd be in pretty dire trouble, which is where we are. But the question this raises for me in the art is, all right, so you have some process of selection here. There are a lot of elements in here. Some aspects of the climate problem are represented and some not. And I'm kind of wondering, how you select those things. Do you have goals for the audience, or things that particularly interest you, or what sort of principle of thinking about selection goes into what's in and what's out?
Well, just to give you a little backdrop on this work, when I started to make sculpture, it was a time when I was actually only doing painting. So painting was my area, and I can't even really say the painting was my area because I only went to graduate school for 2 years, and my undergraduate experience was in plastics. So I knew a little bit about the consumption rate that we were striving for from working for companies that was interested specifically in creating plastics that would be part of our economy and would create a lot of money for the U.S. And specifically the kinds of chemicals and solvents that would be participating, the oil companies. And so these oil companies then created the painting world, which is acrylics. And acrylics was in vogue for a very short time while it was competing with oil painting. And very much like the past, where it was considered very masculine to use oil paints, and because it could last longer, there was this idea that your painting wasn't as serious and therefore was not as valuable in the art market. And this was true for watercolor painting. So when I came out of painting, out of graduate school, I started to immediately go into sculpture, which is what I wished to do. So not having a traditional or conventional education, I wanted to take everything into my work. And looking at the whole meant choosing from the whole and what that whole is. Having been in a situation where it was preferred that your artwork, your sculpture, be made of one pure element, like marble, which is our tradition, or iron or steel. There was also a tradition of making works out of plastic, fiberglass, blue foam, building foam. And there was a lot of materials in the market at that time that was being absorbed into sculpture, which was coming out of building. Basically any kind of building you look at, the force is to create as much of it out of plastic rather than the traditional materials. So this was very much the way to make sculpture. So I started to use natural materials, and that meant things like fur and feathers and beads and all these things that were not considered valuable and should not be used. It was really a kind of taboo that you should not use these materials. They cannot last long, including things like linen and cotton Even though paintings were made of canvas, there was very little awareness that you're working on a textile. And so I started to put as much stuff into my work because I was so excited about being a sculptor and not a painter, and that there was limitless things that I wanted to position in my work. World Lost came about at the Smithsonian. They had asked me to do one sculpture in the atrium, and I wanted to do the sculpture really specifically about the loss of water, or the difficulty of water, and also the pollutants in the water. And having gone to school at Case Western Reserve, which is in Cleveland, there's a history where the lakes there were burning because of the industry that was so prevalent in the Midwest and near Lake Michigan. So I knew a little bit about that. And I grew to learn that a lot of the things that I had accumulated in my studio to make sculpture, which was not embraced in the sculpture or fine art world, were becoming more and more rare, including items like coins that I have now been no longer being used from all over the world, places specifically where I travel. They are really my coins. And when I started, I wanted to economize. I didn't have the resources then, and I still don't have those kinds of resources. So often I would go to things that we would consider very accessible to everyone, the public. And they were souvenirs. They were, at least everything in the miniature was what I could afford. And literally the size of an object is how we measure the value of a painting still. Dramatically, that is the truth. And the size of a sculpture is how we measure how much a painting or a sculpture should be worth. So one of the things that I like to explore was this weightlessness, to make sculpture lightweight, to make it kind of empty and not solid. All these factors were really kind of a way to explore what has not been done to some extent, and what cannot be accepted. I've made, to reference the pink Taj, which, as you can see, is this huge dome with 4 little domes. I made a number of sculptures that were Taj Mahals. One was green and one was yellow. And the green one in Japan got thrown out because they didn't have value, not only for the architecture that was so well embraced in the West, that people were excited about, and had some knowledge of the Taj Mahal, had some appreciation for the travel to India, which was part of our history here, but they had no desire for the Taj. And I was very excited about this moment, this kind of correspondence with Japan. That was like 2006. They did end up throwing it out, and they didn't care if someone wanted to buy it. That was not the position by which they would decide whether they should keep or throw out. There were all these inextricable ways in which you can command the value of things. So getting back to World Lost, how do we understand the value of such a large thing as the Earth? To really preserve it, to think about it as a live thing, to think that we have impact on it, and that it has impact on our own lives, is a very complex and intimate relationship that we haven't really fostered, especially when your heads are pretty much in the trough of eating the world. And so all these things, many of these things that I picked out for the floor, the landscape that I call it, it's kind of a smearing, if you would, which is a process by which I would make paintings, smearing things on the wall. And to show that the hand was picking out things, and they're so small and so delicate and so cheap at the same time, that it urges you to want, to desire, to bend down to see it, and then to desire the smallness of it and its availability so that you feel like maybe I should take it. And this is a relationship we have with the earth, that if it's here, it shines, it desires me, I desire it, should we take it? I don't know if I'm really suggesting that you should or shouldn't, or that even that this piece really requires you to feel enamored with the earth, its value. But definitely it makes you try to think of scale and how it positions your emotions and your value system, which is what all of us experience in every day, you know. And I think that the dome, which you can visit again in this piece, which is a little harder to recognize, is the steel structure, which is upside down, which alludes to madness as it was envisioned in the Middle Ages through a painting I saw, where the reference to the upside down dome or the right side up funnel talks about the brain leaking out, so to speak, and also time, the measure of time to value, the value of the earth at different times in our memory of the world, in our history, in the 12th century or in the 1800s or now. What do we think of in terms of positioning the credibility of value? Can we value the earth? Those are the things that call into question and call our participation in understanding global warming, I think.
Thank you. That was helpful to kind of think about the way in which scale works in the piece and the sort of miniaturization of the floor and in relation to the larger whole. But I'm also interested in scale in the piece in a different way, in the sense that while my understanding is, and at least from photographs and things, you essentially remake the landscape that's on the floor anew in each new gallery space, so that it's a very different landscape depending on the particular environment that it's in. But that one element of the piece that remains a constant is the pan scales at the center of it that are hanging from the
balance.
The balance.
Yeah, the French balance.
Yeah, and so that's such a suggestive object, and in part from what you were just saying, the extent to which it conjures up value, and it can be a scale used for commerce, but it's also the central emblem, usually in kind of Western representations of justice, as justice holds the scales, and the sword, in the other hand, to deliver punishment. I'd be curious to hear you talk more about your choice of that particular object at the center of this piece that's kind of engaging with climate. And my curiosity is driven in part by ways in which there are the potential conceptual limitations, actually, of even thinking in terms of balance when it comes to something like justice in relation to climate. Two pans to represent a broader, kind of almost like infinitely complex set of actors and agents that might need justice. And at the same time, also trying to think about the way in which balance becomes such an important metaphor for ecologists sometimes to sort of think about the relationship of different elements of an ecosystem. Climate change is a moment of having gotten out of balance, in effect, and there's a long sort of history of thinking in terms of, problematically, potentially even thinking in terms of like balance and harmony as what's happening in nature, as opposed to nature as something where it's everything struggling against everything else for a kind of finite number of resources. And so this is a very kind of circuitous way of just really kind of trying to talk about what a provocative emblem that is, and maybe hear more from you about your choice of that object as one of the kind of constants in the piece.
When I made the piece, I was really attracted to the scale, and just to share with you some of my personal kind of experience. I remember going to the market in Kolkata. I don't really know where it was, but my mom made me go. And she would tell me the scale is always cheating. And she would teach me how not to be cheated most of the time. And how to be clever and be cautious. And always to be ready for the haggling of what is a fair price. And this instrument that was supposed to be honored, nobody honored. There's no such thing as a balance that tells the truth. And so you really were never surprised to see that what you were getting for whatever it's worth was not worth what you thought, and you didn't care if the balance was there or not. It was a kind of an instrument of science in some ways that would bring order to these two groups of people, the people who had the goods and the people who didn't have that but had to get that. And in some ways, as one of my galleries told me, you have to figure out a way to let the people who have money let it go. That's our job. And and it's really about my mom's excitement to go to the market was not even about getting the food to our table, but really the excitement of that conversation. What will it be today? Not, will I get the fish, or will I get the mangoes, or will I get, something from the butcher? Will it be clean? She knew who to go to for everything, So, and she knew what, generally speaking, the price would be and everything. And she taught me a lot about the quality of things, no matter what the balance said. I don't even know what the balance was there. But people did have it high up as this, kind of place where you found stability in this conversation. One could always go back to the balance. It was kind of an inanimate referee to the chaos that is true of everything we do. There's always chaos and there's always instability. And what I liked about this balance and where I positioned it, in some ways, it makes the whole largeness and the instability of the piece come to, in terms of physics, to have a weight underneath it that would bring some sort of stillness, because it's a very lightweight structure that spans out, and it's hung from a single point, which keeps it turning. And I think talking about balance, I think I'm more interested in how our relationship to instability and how important instability can be in making us reach for something that will bring a kind of quality of being fixed. It's almost as if time can be fixed if we have this inanimate object. And I think that's what I like about sculpture. It has a way of positioning time, like holding on to time, and holding all the forces of instability around that focus. And it requires a great deal of collaboration when a transaction is made in the market from all sides. And there is a lot of display of resistance, to the actual transaction. And I think those points when, it doesn't matter if it's the art market or you're trying to gain collaborative impulses from the people, impulses that we all have, is the wish to work together, to cooperate. All these things come to play in using an instrument. And I think, creating things and making things make you realize that it's not what's important, the thing that you made, it's the conversation and the ways in which your mind is allowed to think about the world. Because there really is not supposed to be kind of limit to what you can pull and drag into your studio and what you can pull and drag into the museum as well. So I think a lot of my work is really not that inclusive as I see it. You know, it's often very repetitive. But there is this kind of disguise that creates a sense of stability and balance that makes you believe, and sometimes makes me believe, that this piece is very different from that. And I think that makes all of us, you know, kind of engage with the idea of journey, that we're having a journey, I don't know if we are.
Yeah, I had some thoughts on the temporal perspective of the piece. I'd like to start with some of the temporal perspectives I see in other disciplines in climate change. So a lot of scientists will study the past, right? And so the extreme example is geologists who look at what is the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature over millennia. And then scientists will look at a particular species or changes that they've seen in the world, and can they correlate them with climate change? And they look at a famous example, the increase in carbon and the increase in temperature since the temperature record was created in the 50s of carbon record, and within the period where you had temperature records. Then when you get to policy, people are thinking about the future. And so what you get is scientific models that try to take our dynamics of the system and understanding the system and project how severe, what kind of effects do we expect and how severe will they be? Right, so you see a lot of warming. Could that warm the ice caps? If the ice caps melted, what would happen to the sea? They would rise. And then, you know, can you quantify any of that? And so there's an attempt to try to figure, even before you get to this economist project of dollars, there's an engineering and scientific project of projecting the future so as to inform people of what might happen if we don't act properly. I experienced this piece as a piece from the future looking back at a lost world. That's what it seemed like to me. That is, you know, to me, the stability comes from the fact that you look at this and you think something has happened, and it's sort of over in a way. and something really momentous has happened. That's how I experienced it. I'm wondering if that's how you thought about it at all, or if that, you know, how you think of the time element piece.
Yeah. I think it definitely, in the title, there is this suggestion of looking at something that's already happened. That there's a moment in which, in writing the title, as I was gaining momentum, thinking, I've explained myself to myself, which is what I do in the studio. And then in the end, you know, final finality to the way the title ends with the world, you know, after all this, you know, which is everything. You want to believe that the world ends when you end, but really the world doesn't end. So, I mean, everyone experiences that with the ending of things and the beginning of things, that it still actually continues. Everything continues in some way that we don't accept, and we don't think we will like. It doesn't include us, you know, and we've not included ourselves, for that matter. And so there is a kind of darkness to this piece, and to all the work, there's, you know, inevitably a kind of darkness that is folded into thinking about the beginning of how I make it or why I make it. People see the paintage working with the plastics company for a few years and not wanting to be an engineer because so much of science was really about making these reports, so to legitimize corporate desire to expand and make money. There really wasn't very much room for the science part as an engineer. And working with companies, the eagerness to give you so much of this and to exaggerate how free it was. Do not feel guilty about it. When I asked for the plastic for this piece, they gave me enough to make maybe 1,000 of these pieces with no reason except to convince me that plastic was not only free, cheap, but it was harmless and it was the golden thing because of that. It was the gold of our future. And I think that when I started to think about making art, it was a way for me to reflect on what I left behind, the end of that, to the beginning. And at the same time question, am I really doing something different? Is it really possible? Are all these things related to, associated with the economy of things and how we really treasure that economy? And all of everything we're allowed to even imagine or make has to have some sort of price to it. And the madness of suggesting that all those things that harm the world is not harming. There is these multiple voices, maybe even two voices, suggesting one, everything is safe and we should do more of what we're doing, and the other saying, it's the end.
Well, you just alluded to the darkness of the piece, and I mean, insofar as it is about climate change, inevitably dark, and a lot of that darkness shines through in the kind of elegiac title that you've given the piece, which, of course, A World Lost is just the sort of shorthand for the much longer title of the piece, which keeps repeating the word after, and after each of those things, each of those after worlds appears to be a loss of some kind, something less diverse, more diminished than what you had before. I'm curious to just thinking about how in terms of how the piece works effectively with the audience. At the same time, there seems to be a lot of playfulness in the sort of miniature world that you've created on the floor. Both sometimes like literally using objects of play, like little figurines and things like that are designed for or manufactured as toys, really. But also just in the sort of some of the playful juxtapositions that you have, some of the playful repurposings of something so that it looks like something else. And I also, in your initial kind of being Rina Banerjee session on Zoom on day one of this, it must feel like an eternity ago, I'm sure. You also talked about the kind of joy that you had being immersed in the process of making, or in effect like remaking what's on the floor, and shutting out other things for your mind and getting in the center of that. And so I'm insofar as this is at some level a piece about climate and therefore about climate grief at some level, I'm also kind of curious to think about the kind of potential affective interplay between the title and the making of it and even the joy that one can take in exploring the floor.
Definitely playfulness is a very important process in making work. I think it also allows you to reach, with the idea that you're playing in order to find something new. You're not playing just to play. In that way, you're playing because you have this. You're convinced that if you dig deeper by playing, that you'll find some answers. So experience. A lot of it, I think, I find in playing, I have to use my hands. And, there's really such a long tradition of using tools that are part of convincing people that you have to have a very high skill set to be an artist, which I don't have. And I wasn't really seeking it, but I am in other ways that it doesn't require those tools. So, and the kind of playfulness that I'm inserting into the work, which is in some ways, I think, almost so obvious, that it was really about being able to talk about and think about subject matter that most people at that time and even now are not that happy about, addressing. And to bring a wider range of people, audiences, to the work, to think about what they're thinking about, and by use of the materials itself, what people are familiar with, and feel some sort of connection to. These are not like the kind of materials you find in an art supply store, right? They could be found in a child's room, in different parts of the world. So there are these extremes, the child's room versus the exotic world, the world that the majority of people don't get to insert themselves into. And I think, that's an ingredient in the work. And to be able to, I think one of the things is to be able to work on the floor and to think about the floor. And in that piece, there isn't really a floor kind of situation. Maybe there is a little bit, but it rises off the floor. It's thinking about the floor. So in a number of ways, I'm interested in exploring the possibility of thinking about that in the text as well, the playfulness and the lack of coherence that can happen in having a work that is alongside a title, which is alongside the subject matter that you hope to find in the work, I think. I rarely go to a work and say, I'm going to work on global warming right here. I'm going to start with this thing. It doesn't really happen that way. And I don't think any of these pieces really happen with a consciousness that I'm going to think about this subject. And yet, in so many ways, where we feel a lot of pressure to teach in that way, and to talk about the work, which is kind of a way of teaching. But it doesn't happen that way. You begin to make sense of the things that you feel intimate with, that you find in your surrounding, if not intimate. Even things that you reject have an important significance in your life when you're looking for what shall I bring into this work, And there are lots of things in all these works that I dislike. Wish I could just edit it out, and in every point when I have to revisit my work, it's not really always fun to visit your own work over, 30 years. And it reminds you of different points in your life that you understood things in a way that was true, not true, or even that you didn't appreciate things. And so the appreciation part is a kind of really a torturous exercise. And can you appreciate your own art sometimes, or your own work? Is it good enough for you to want to consume it? And inevitably, I think I always feel like there's something else I want to make, and that's really the best place to start thinking about what is that work. So I guess what I'm saying is this piece can mean so many things later on and in the past and in between. And so it teaches you about yourself. And the ingredient that is always changing or variable in this work is really that floor area. And so far this is my only piece where there is that one element which is part of the sculpture, which has to be recreated each time. There's a huge price to pay for me right now to do that. And it's kind of a way for me to think, can I make this go in a different direction when I revisit this piece? Is it possible to make it into another piece and have the container of those things that are fixed in the ingredients and those things that I add and subtract? So that makes the piece more live and more part of the future.
And you added a crow feather from campus, I think.
Oh, yeah. That's all I got.
Was that a specific object that you were seeking out in some way for, as a suggested, or is it? Was it
I didn't ask for it,
Okay.
but I think it's always interesting what people. A lot of the things in this piece on the floor are things people gave me, you know, and that so it's a little bit of a conversation with what people think the piece desires or what they think could be, you know, in the piece. So it's always interesting.
Just suggestive, since they're known as foragers, so they're.
Yeah. Oh, are they? Yeah.
Well, yeah, I want to pick up on the sort of the effective elements of the piece, or what effect it has, emotional impact. And I guess I keep relating everything back to climate, because that's what I think about, too narrow a frame. But you know, it matters a lot. You know, people like to, you know, struggle in the technocratic fields with why doesn't everybody understand this problem and therefore take the actions needed to address it. Of course, the answer is that people respond to things in varying ways emotionally, right? So if it's really awful to contemplate, they don't think about it, or they don't believe it, or they figure there's nothing I can do about it. As often as it's hard to have a sense of efficacy in dealing with it. And so the emotional impact of things is important. So when I first looked at the piece, I looked at the floor, and my reaction was, maybe this should be called the displaced floor instead of the lost floor, because I got this feeling of, you know, seas having moved everything around, maybe goes wandering off. You know. And then I looked at the top, and then I saw the lost world. You know, to me, that was because you have this feeling that there was something there and it's gone. And I don't even know what that something was, but you referred to mountains in the description, so I guess there's some glacier melt or something going on. And to me, like the really emotionally wrenching thing was the slow rotation of the top element, because to me, that felt like, you know, somebody had experienced a trauma and was still revealing. That's kind of something I felt the trauma was. So that's how it felt to me. And you know, so I'm kind of interested in, you know, how other people reacted to it and presented it.
I know.
That kind of thing. And how do you think about that?
Well, it is a very empty piece on top,
Yeah.
you know, and there is a feeling of, I feel, of it being pulled down, you know, like uncovering, stripping away. I mean, I was very interested in making the piece a little more skeletal, you know, empty, and it's the idea of emptying the world, you know, of all its contents. If you think of the whole world as a bottle of things. And it creates a sense of weight that is being pulled off the structure that is lurking above this land so close as if it might fall. So there is this, I felt, like this danger that you create when two objects come very close to each other, but they you don't know what the reasons for it. There's no connection that you can see. This hovering aspect, which I'm always excited about in the work. And I think that when you make something that is kind of reveals its skeleton, it also has this kind of darker response to maybe.
But I should add, there's a weird kind of beauty to it too. I mean, I don't look at it as only dark elements. I don't know why, but
I'm curious to hear more about, so it is site specific in the sense that you're recreating the floor each time, which you refer to as a landscape, but it's also, it's hung here next to Hudson River School painting, Hudson River School landscape, and so I'm interested in thinking about the kind of way in which you're creating a landscape on the floor and how you might think of the piece as in dialogue with kind of traditions of landscape art, which are often critiqued as a kind of imperial gaze, or manifest destiny, and at the same time, interestingly, like nearly immediately behind the wall of the gallery on the other side is a piece by Robert Smithson of, and not one of his non-site pieces, and I even was thinking about the, Smithson's most famous piece of landscape with Spiral Jetty. You've got these little spirals almost on the floor, and I don't know how conscious that was or not, but I am curious to kind of, as an engagement with climate change and thinking about other kinds of art forms that represent landscape and make interventions into landscape and ecological systems, how much you imagine your piece as in dialogue with some of those traditions or not.
Yeah, I mean, the Hudson Valley paintings, I've seen them when I was younger, of course, and they have a kind of peacefulness that you imagine, or I think you feel like it's talking about this beautiful landscape that is both natural and wild and at peace with the rest of the world, which is surprising because when you actually look at a landscape in real life, it's not that peaceful. And with that difference, which I didn't really acknowledge until later, that I had experienced what it is like to be in these landscapes where the Hudson River is on either side of the Hudson if you're from the New York area. It's very intimidating and treacherous landscapes are, especially if you live in that era, I could imagine. But this kind of peacefulness alludes to the fact that it welcomes you. It wants you to enter the painting, enter the world, that you belong there, and you can somehow relax when you've arrived. And there's a feeling of having arrived at the right place, where the view is so perfect, you want to buy that real estate and put a house there, is what I think of now. And so those things that we find entertaining about a work is also there in my work too. There is a kind of feeling of welcoming that it alludes to all these pieces that we depend on to make people look. And then, there's also disguise. I don't know if the other work that you were referring to is unconnected to what is already there in nature. These kinds of patterns, spirals that we see all over that we're very attracted to are very much, I think, part of our biology and our psyche. you know, even things that we think that are very original, I don't know if they really are. There are these combinations of experiences and things that we're made of that make the work look the way they do, or even paintings we want to stand in front of for, you know, a length of time. When you find yourself in the surrounding of your possessions, you realize the possessions are really about not your own history, but about being human, you know. And so in some sense they are surprises only because you entertain them to be surprises, entertain them to be unique and uniquely an expression of that artist versus this artist, or are they bouncing off, did I get influenced by this one or that period of art or the Renaissance. And these things we always entertain as a way to start a conversation, I think, more than anything. But I do think that these things we deem original are really part of who we are already.
We'll open up the floor for questions so that people can make a part of who you are as well, Rina. So thank you so much to all three speakers. Questions from the audience? Yes, Corinne.
So I have a question about the idea of the world lost and the concept of the world. So, I mean, we've got a lawyer here, and I don't know the law, obviously, like you do, but my sense is that part of the struggle of climate law is like who has standing, right? Like without, like, you kind of need human subjects to, or collective, individual or collective to make claims, and species are not making claims on, you know, so I'm really interested in your idea of a world lost, and when we think about the world, like one of the things that as I was sitting here thinking and looking, I think one of the things I like about your work is that even though you have this collective concept of a world lost, the nature of your sculpture is also disaggregating that collectivity of the worldness. So I guess I'd just be interested in having anybody play with that idea about what is that kind of collective identity and what counts as a subject as we think about the world lost and who can make claims to it.
Well, I mean, when I think of things being lost, I think of possessions, you know, that you don't possess these things to begin with. All these things that you collected, or all the things that represent animals and resources, raw materials. And I think that when I'm addressing a world loss, I'm also trying to realize for myself that possessions, when we feel we possess them, we feel a sense of wealth and comfort and safety in a way that we won't feel when you feel like it should be natural for you to own these animals and see them and see what you've seen. There's a kind of resistance to time itself that allows us to feel stability, or to at least herd time, like you herd animals. And I think that where you begin to let go of possessions is when you feel there's something more valuable that doesn't have to be solid, that you already have and cannot be leached off of you or mined off of you or taken from your hands. And, you know, and when you arrive there, you have a sense of kind of stability or balance, I suppose that you were saying.
And I'm just thinking about the, there's a debate in effect within, I think, a lot of people who work on climate change as to whether or not something like the world or whether or not the global is the appropriate lens as opposed to something like the planetary. And I mean, there's the, I think like Dipesh Chakrabarty's point that the global and globalization is not the same as the global and global warming. And that in the disjunction between those two things, in effect, like you have different scales of justice. So when we talk about climate justice, we're often thinking about human justice, really.
Right.
But that, sort of what you're referring to is actually almost something more like where at least his attraction is partially to the term planetary, to kind of think about that other register where you might have, a United Nations that's not made of just nations, but of something like an interspecies, which is a kind of utopian possibility, but it's the problem in effect.
I mean, when I think of the world loss thing, the way it's come up in the law a lot is some of the fundamental objectives of the law, especially the natural resources law, actually, that's environmentally protected, is to preserve existing states. So the notion, which is not entirely true, but it's a useful organizing myth, is that there is an existing harmony that's fairly stable, and that you want to keep that. And so you prevent the endangered species from vanishing by preserving its ecosystem more or less as it was. And once this got going, some of the more perceptive writers in the natural resources field recognized that this was kind of out the window, that the stable world, somewhat stable world was gone. What does it mean to preserve endangered species and its habitat when the habitat became hostile to it because it changed so much? And so this is a strand of thinking in environmental law. But there is this sense, although clearly the effects are, this is why it's so difficult to describe and know it all. There's localized effects, but at the same time there's a global climate system that is being profoundly changed. The world is changing, and the world we knew is lost. I mean, already, unimaginable things are happening at the scale of droughts, and it just would not have been anywhere near this frequent. Droughts, fires, sea level floods, violent storms. That all of these things were familiar to us, but only as occasional episodic things, and now they're happening, over and over again.
In terms of the sculpture itself, not everything has to have like a one-to-one representation, but I thought it was interesting the sort of black tusks around the otherwise like fairly world-like shape, or this bulb dome that kind of expands the reach of the dome, as well as kind of adds to this kind of skeletalness or like spider imagery around it. What was kind of the thought process with adding those shapes to the dome?
Certainly balance, but I think they were always the American bison, which those horns represent, and it's a replica, so it's not the real thing. Which I used to use. They are kind of echo into that piece, and the idea of it kind of spreading out its arms, so to speak. And they have a way of creating danger. That is what is animals that seek kind of protection through fighting with your horns, for example. I mean, without the literal examination of what horns are for, they create a sense of animalness of the dome itself, if it were, and rather than architectural. And the ropes that are on the higher sections of its armature are kind of hairy too. So I'm alluding to kind of animal, I suppose, things that we associate with animals. to make it more animal-like rather than architecture. So it can be conceived of as a figurative element in that sense. And all the rubbish, the, kind of junk that is on the very bottom, which is very crusty, is also something that we associate with age and decay and existence, something that is dragged on barnacles in a ship. You can think of it as a hot air balloon or a ship that has this kind of age or time that is associated with that accumulation on the bottom. And I think that when you make a piece that is this weird, is very specifically realizing aspects of scale and things that are dislocated and disassociated from other places, you're kind of, wondering, what does this make me think it is? And what does this say about the subject matter of it? I mean, I always think of anything that's pointy as piercing or wanting to go forward, like a plane wants to go forward, or our nose wants to go forward to smell things ahead of us. Not very far ahead for me, but for other people maybe further ahead. So you do think about those things that, when you use the word nose dive, the idea, I just saw Pinocchio, so I can't help but think about that. This kind of sensory thing that is part of a live thing, whether it senses smell or smell doesn't exist in that way through the nose. These sensory things that are the nail, the dome, which could be the brain or the missing brain, which feels around kind of this lost in this environment, a different environment. So there is a play of space and the ground versus the active, which is the figure that we assume when we identify with the dome as that, which is the being.
We'll take Roger and then we'll come to Julie.
Thank you for a fascinating conversation. I'm curious to hear about what role, if there is a role, to gravity in the conceptualization of your work, as well as the construction of the work. Because in redoing the painting for each installation, gravity forces you down. That you're working on the ground. There's a tension. I feel there's a tension between the groundedness of the painting, the groundwork, versus the lightness of the mobile, the sculptural aspects that and really working in some of your other pieces.
There's also a dome over here.
Yeah.
But I've disguised it as a parachute beyond the figure. Sometimes people don't recognize it's a parachute. It's a parachute that has a flower-like image. So unlike the horns, right, as opposed to the covered image of the dome. I think gravity is something you always have to contend with if you want your pieces to look airy and light. I like the presence of air in my work. I desire it. And I think my wishfulness to do large work is to have a lot of air in it and to not have it look heavy or be heavy. Something that is monumental can be something that is very elusive in that way. Its presence and it lingers in you. You long for things that are eerie, like big clouds. And I haven't seen a lot of work that was like that. And I think that when you use materials that are, I think, no longer probably unconventional, you draw people in large pieces by creating air, because people are really attracted to air and space, not objects. So that's what commands people to get near, given our physical size, to get near something large. So this is conceptually something you think about, but also in terms of how you play on the weightlessness of an object.
One definition of three-dimensionality in media and immersion is like when air becomes visible, when it, as a medium, then you achieve that.
Yeah, I think architecture definitely, like especially in New York, you're seeing more and more glass buildings. Everything is glass, and everything is rectilinear, which is more true now than it was when I was interested in the dome as an architectural space, but it's also a celestial body in many ways when you see it in the landscape or in the skyscape. It's unusual, and it marks the past, right? This sense of air that we desire to own air is the next frontier by making everything into glass. And it does look like water and air that is made concrete and part of our desire to have real estate in this kind of container is what people desire. They desire the sun, the air, and really this kind of the experience of water, being near water. Those are very desirous.
So we'll take one more question, and then after that, I know if you have a question. Are you a student?
Yeah.
Okay, Joanne, would you mind if we keep him? Because what we will do is, there is a wonderful reception outside. If you haven't glimpsed the tasty foods that have been laid out for you, and maybe Joanne, if you don't mind, we'll give at least a student a
I'm
chance.
due to say, she had her hand up first, so if you want.
Well, let me ask my
Okay,
question.
you can ask your question, and then we want you to quickly ask, and then we can move
Yeah,
on.
which is very nice. I want to think about the whole environment we're in, and ultimately it's taken me to a place of love. And I'm thinking of the pink here and the pink here, and then I'm thinking of this. And I'm trying to understand how it all relates. Why is this piece in an environment that says, welcome to a place of love? And why are these together in the same exhibit?
Well, all three pieces have some measure of approaching the idea or the emotion of love as a substantial way of understanding maybe the legend. But in the pink Taj, when my interest in making it was happened, if I can recall, the time when I saw this old vintage Bollywood movie. I don't even think it was considered Bollywood. It was something, because my mother didn't allow that. And it was a black and white movie where the woman in a sari is on the floor. And I don't think she wore a sari, I can't remember. But it was white, and she had maybe the dupatta. And she was begging this man, and this was the representation of love that I saw in my black and white TV at home. We didn't have a color TV. And it was odd because it was supposed to be how the passion of love, the kind of almost the momentum. And she was begging him to take her to the Palace of Love. So she actually said, which is the title of the word, the words that I use, take me to the Palace of Love, with a pause in between. It's almost like she didn't know where to be taken. And then the Palace of Love being that monumental space of transformation, of being rescued and saved. In this work, it is about the way this couple came to know of each other through their separate migrations, which had all kinds of problems, and the negotiation and collaboration that took place that allowed them to some extent create a life for themselves of practicality and business, and to live their lives in some level of safety for the interracial couple that they were, Violida Lewis. And I suggest in the title that she's a rescue worker, because the flight of many people who came to the shores of Harlem to go to the different cities was really questionable, as it was for many immigrants, as the quintessential immigrant story of danger. So she is a rescue worker in the opposite sense, that she's arrived into a new place from migration from the South, and she has a parachute. And there is this kind of level of how does one, in the midst of the policies that were in place during that time, how does government look at marriage, and how does it become a vehicle to escape, so one can then understand the connection as it is. It's really one of the few ways that women feel access to being saved from the treachery of what the world offers in its limited ways, its own kind of prison that the world is for women in terms of their choices. And the world lost, in some sense, again, is really about our love for the world, but a love for all the things that are contained in it that we thought were ours, but we realized they're to be shared. And I think that those two parameters of approaching love really allows you to think about what is yours and how much what you assign as yours become fought after and sought after and experienced with other people's designs on it as real estate.
So we will take one more question from our lovely student here. And then I do want to thank, by the way, our lovely Tolley professor for providing all the refreshments outside. Sorry, Mike, I should have acknowledged you. But Rina, briefly, maybe if you respond to him, because I do want him to have a chance to ask you the question as well. So go ahead.
Quickly, I'm from the Philly area, so seeing all this was a welcome deja vu. I was excited to come here. So I wanted to ask, obviously, a lot of all of these pieces are very philosophically, very ideologically complex. At what point during your creative process does that really enter the fold? Is that from the start, or when do those sorts of things begin to inform the art you're making?
Well, I didn't really approach the subject of my work as complex, but I was really interested in the very basic things that we strive to have in our lives, and the things that are kind of difficult to have a life, to make your own life. And so all the works really think about what does it mean for us to have our own life? What does it take? And what does one have to do to fight for that life when it's not necessarily easy to imagine in your mind? So I'm glad you saw it in Philly, because that was an amazing architectural space to work with for anyone. And I think that one of the things that I really liked about being in Syracuse, if I can depart into Syracuse and being here for 2 weeks, and this being towards the end of those 2 weeks, is the beauty of the downtown and how much was built here and how much history is and how it's so empty, those spaces, And whenever I visit a place, I like to roam, walk, and jog mostly, and see that. And I think that the life of a place as opposed to a person is a very important thing to recognize that something has passed. You know, a time has passed. And you look at the new buildings that are being built downtown, and it's very hard to like them compared to all the photographic images of old buildings. And those old buildings, those photographs don't really have the kind of horrors of the past, as always. So we're looking at really the labor of people, the skills of people, and the kind of drive that economy had to create these buildings in proximity to create the downtown of Syracuse. And a lot of places downtown or in general are being emptied too, of people as they scatter.
So as we scatter to partake of refreshments, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you all for coming. This last conversation with Rina, which will be continued with you, of course, Professor Spivak, tomorrow. So thank you. Please come eat, enjoy.